Everyone is here, and it's a pleasure in order to deliver the last discussion of these 2 days before the weekend and before the Monday questions. So this is the general overview that I wanted to be able to present, and this is a little dynamic in that we threw in some things at different points based off of questions off these days. So I apologize if things are a little raw in their presentation. So this is the overview of what I wanted to discuss, and the first one is the philosophy of OER. The second one is the legalities and ethics of OER, which is related to the philosophy. The third component is a little bit more directed toward LibreTexts in general, which is the distribution mechanisms of the LibreText project. And this is part of the barriers that one may have in order to encounter that. And then I'll be discussing a bit about the LibreNet, which was mentioned a few times over the last couple of days, which is our sustainability dissemination mechanism outside of the campus that, or campuses that we happen to reside. In order to be able to move our project forward, so we're not crying in the gutter when our federal support dries up, if it dries up. So let me start from the beginning and ask a relatively simple question. What is OER? And there's no reason to necessarily put that into the chat window, but to internalize that sort of question here. So we're all familiar with the acronym of OER, referring to Open Educational Resource. And while resource is well defined and educational is well defined, open is not entirely as well defined as one may envision. And that's the point of this introduction here. So this slide animation didn't come up exactly how I wanted it, but it will do so. So, so I'm going to use the definition of the William and Florette Hewlett Foundation, which has been quite instrumental in moving OER in America over the last decade and a half. And this is from their website. An open educational resources are free and openly licensed educational materials that can be used for teaching, learning, research, and other purposes. And you can see, obviously, that open is defined there very cleanly in red, but the key point here is also to emphasize the word license. So what is missing from this definition? In this case here, I can let people hopefully put a chat in. Is there anything here missing? Especially based off of got reuse. I haven't discussed this, some of the definitions of what open is yet, but when I introduced OER in order to handle two primary textbook issues, what were those issues and how did it address it? Yesterday, that is. Assuming that you guys can remember yesterday after all the Zoom pounding you've had. Yes, we got cost that pops up there. So essentially, there's nothing in this definition that says free. So the guiding principle in order to be able to address address the textbook problem, in order to be able to generate free textbooks to be distributed out there, and that's a key aspect. So we could flip to a different definition that came out earlier this year. Does it say free? Freely. Free and open. Okay, details. Yeah. Okay. So I'm a little distorted off of that. Okay. Now, thanks, Paul. You're right. Now I'm a little off track here. So let me go to the UNESCO definition, because the UNESCO definition is a little bit more explicit here in terms of talking about OER as materials that are in the public domain or intellectual property licenses that facilitate free use, adaptation, distribution. So it starts to get into this reuse aspect that Sam mentioned here. And free is added in there as it is in the earlier definition. But there's a bit of inconsistency oftentimes in the OER community about whether OER is supposed to be free. In fact, there are a lot of companies that commercialize OER in order to be able to operate. So there's a bit of a conflict in terms of the free aspect and the open aspect, and the two are not necessarily synonymous. But the point I wanted to emphasize in both these definitions is that the term license or is there. So intrinsically in the discussion of OER is licensing, and that's where we're going to be transitioning here. So the first thing I wanted to mention, some of the complexities that we have to deal with in the English language is that the English word uses the term free to distinguish two primary concepts. It designates freedom, as in liberty, and cost. So in Romance languages, you would call this Libra, which is where LibreText comes from, and cost would be gratis, Gratis. And those are very distinctly different concepts. One deals with not being connected to restrictions, and the other one is connected to not being able to pay for things. And the English language conflates the two concepts off of that. So whenever we talk about open, open is the opposite of closed, or suggests as something closed. Open is free in liberty, but then you have to ask exactly how free is free, because there's a wide gradation in terms of liberty out there, and there's also a less complexities in terms of free based off of cost, but yet you have some underlining questions in terms of sustainability and other aspects that come out there. So defining characteristic of OER, the 5 R's. This is something that David Wiley put out about 15 years ago, and it's sort of the constitution of the bedrock associated with OER. Many people start to expand them with 6 R's, 7 R's, and other various permutations, but I'm just going to go to the canonical 5 R's in this discussion here, and in which we start to argue the permissions that you have via freedom based off of liberty that OER may provide in order to be able to implement it, but not necessarily always provide. Where is this not? Okay. This was supposed to, but it didn't really work out right. So we have retain, reuse, revise, remix, and redistribute. Again, the 5 R's. So retain basically says that you have the permission in order to hold the content in its, at least in its unadulterated original content. So that's the tantamount to you use a class and you have copy of the exact version of this textbook used in that class forever. So you're able to hold on to it. Reuse gives you the ability in order to tap into and copy those contents, duplicate, store off of that. Revise gives you the ability not just to store that content, but to edit that content in order to suit your specific needs. It's the customization aspect that's critical and underlies basically every aspect of how the LibreText operates. Remix gives you the ability in order to take content and start to slice and dice them and use them in original ways in order to suit what you're doing here. And redistribute gives you the ability in order to take what you've constructed and then give it to someone else. In principle, when you construct something 100% yourself, you give the ability in order to designate individual components of these 5 R's to different people. And you have the freedom to be able to do it. And this intrinsically introduces the complexity associated with OER, because you have to designate what privileges or what rights you have for the OER. And it's a little bit more complicated than other things. So I oftentimes talk about OER in terms of big O and little o. So the big O in projects are the ones that fully embrace the 5 R's in every manifestation possible. There are projects out there, and I won't name them, that have OER with little o, that oftentimes are resistant to actually adopting the open, the 5 R's, but are forced to based on the licensing that they're doing here. So the key point in OER is to recognize that open is a paradigm shift that is different from how we were educated and how the world traditionally operates. And this is one of the reasons that has hindered the growth of OER. Because academically, we're used to the concept of you write a paper, you have a byline on that paper, and it is your paper, and if anyone grabs it, it's still your paper. You have an ownership associated with that, and that's intrinsic to academic publishing, and it's intrinsic to just the way that we tend to view things. The concept of OER is to say, well, you still are able to get attributions to it, but you're essentially sharing your content to the greater community under the arguments that when you share it to the greater community, then everyone's able to benefit and move forward. And that conflicts a bit with the basic principles of academic education. And obviously that conflicts a bit with publishing aspects, where when you take something and you publish it, that is, you take something you created and you distribute it in some very specific format, it's not typically, just because you can view it does not mean it's open. It doesn't mean you have those 5 R's available off of it. And that's a key aspect for anyone who's working in OER, that just because you can view something on the internet does not mean it's OER. Just because that you have the rights to view something, you are unable to take it. And then OER conflicts with most business models, at least traditional business models, of having something and then selling it like a textbook and being able to distribute it. That doesn't mean you can't construct new business models in order to work around OER and the 5 R's, but most business models don't operate like that, and that includes most publishers. So it's the reason why publishers are not switching their business models into OER-based approaches. But these are intrinsic paradigms in the way that we view these things. So we have these 5 R's and these 5 permissions, and the way that we have these things formulated is within the context of the legality of OER content, and that's designated by the licensing of the content. So there's a wide range of different licensing out there. So once you've constructed something, by the right of being an author is copyrighted by yourself. At least within America, in order to be able to establish that. Whether or not you declare it, it remains to be seen, which means that you have the rights to dictate about what you constructed, how it can be used, whether it's the 5 R's or if you want to stay outside those things. So one of the most popular, at least from a couple decades and previously, of OER would be the public domain. So it's basically saying that there are no limitations of any kind. You can take a resource and you can use it in any way, whether it's commercial, not commercial, edit it, and destruct, and such. It's exceedingly powerful. It's the most flexible opportunity out there. You know, for your information, there's infrastructure in place in the federal government in order to be able to put content into public domain under the arguments that it's in the best interest for the community to tap into it. You know, all works that are published before the end of 1924 have lost their copyright protection. You can tap into it. So this would be, for example, why Disney was able to tap into the Brothers Grimm stories extensively, because those stories were all in public domain. But then Disney is copyrighted those stories that they have then put themselves and put it into their domain. And there's a lot of interesting aspects about how public domain and Disney is connected if you want to pursue that aspect here. In the middle 80s, a set of licensing, a framework of licensing came out primarily based off of open source software. Now, the GNU Foundation was the ones that pursued this. Nowadays, these licensings are most used again with software, but in the middle 200s and even a little bit earlier, they were also extended to dealing with non-software based things like manuals to associate content, software, and other things. They are not well suited for dealing with things that are not software, and because of that, it resulted in the formation of an infrastructure that was well suited for doing so, and that's where Creative Commons came in. And Creative Commons is a well thought out infrastructure in order to support OER out there with a range of different licensing that gives you different permissions in order to be able to handle the 5 R's or subset of the 5 R's. The problem with that is that while it's sophisticated, it's complicated. And it's easily one of the most difficult barriers in order to overcome when you're trying to remix content, in order to identify what permissions you have and what permissions you don't have with specific content out there. But it's the nature of the beast in dealing with OER these days. Let me mention a few things about the permissions that Creative Commons provides. Typically, there are 4 basic principles that you have available with Creative Commons licensing. One is the requirement of attribution. So if you use content and they have an attribution, or what's called a by entry onto it, it means that you always have to attribute the original author in every single manifestation of what's going on here. So this is essentially the way in which you can claim ownership or byline status of what you created, and it doesn't just erase your contributions to what you've done. The second one is share alike. And share alike is essentially something like taking the licensing and putting it into a lockbox and throwing it into the sea, and you can't tap into it. It basically means you don't have the permission to change the licensing on the material. Now, so that then suggests that you do have permission when you don't have that share alike clause into it in order to change the licensing. That's true within certain limitations, which is going to be what you're going to be discussing in the breakout room. The last one is, or second one is non-commercial. And this is essentially saying that when a license has a non-commercial clause on it, and it's a Creative Commons license, no one can make a commercial profit off of it. Now, that doesn't mean that you can't claim some revenue in order to sustain the distribution of it, which there's legal justifications for interpreting it that way. But by and large, no one can make money off of that. And there are many academics who build content that like to have the non-commercial clause on it because they don't want anyone to be able to make money off of that. So, for example, OpenStax does not have their non-commercial clause, at least with the exception of one book, their calculus book, which means is you can grab an OpenStax books and you can sell it. And there are lots of companies that are selling OpenStax books because they don't have a commercial clause off of it. And most of them are also giving a cut back to OpenStax because that's how they of that is the no derivatives clause. And the no derivatives clause essentially says that no one can edit the content. That's a simplified way in order to describe it. There are complexities involved in all of these things. So that's that's used, for example, if you make something like a poem and you don't want anyone to be able to edit the content because the integrity of what was constructed is the nature of what you're dealing with here. Content that has the no derivatives clause is typically not referred to as open. In fact, Michelle Pilati and the California Community College OERI team would like to call it FOPEN because it's faux as in fake open out there. But there are lots of content out there that has a no derivative clause off of it, and it's a very difficult thing in order to deal with, and it's to be avoided in all circumstances. So these are the four clauses associated with Creative Commons licensing, and what you'll notice is I actually took this text from Amy Hoffer at Open Oregon, and it was originally licensed as Creative Commons Attribution 4.0, which is the type that they had, and it's international. Those are not overly important. The key point is attribution, which means for me to use this slide, I need to attribute her. And that's what I did. So I use this effectively in reusing this content out there. Okay, so I am getting close to the breakout room where you're actually going to be addressing these things. This should have been deleted, but let me just mention this sort of range. So you can take these range of different combinations of adding different clauses in order to make a range of different licensing that varies from public domain, which means no restrictions at all, to all rights reserved, which essentially is not OER and means you can't do anything. And you may not even be able to view it off of it. And then you can add different components, including by, which most Creative Commons licensing have, share alike, non-commercial. You can add them together to make by, NC, share alike. You can make an ND, non-derivatives and such. And you can make this sort of scope in order to talk about different levels of openness, from really open over here to not very open here, or even FOPEN, using that parlance I did before, or completely not open. So the key point in remixing content, whether it's remixing content on the LibreText or off the LibreText, is to be able to identify the license so you can be able to decide what type of privileges that you have. And the key aspect I want to talk about is the ability of taking content from two different things and combining it together. So you can make this sort of Punnett square or perturbation or logic square in order to talk about different permutations of books and how you can mix things together. Now, the key aspect off of the LibreText is that we provide the ability in order to put the license on an individual page, not on the individual book. So that means that you can mix content from different sources that are not allowed to be remixed, because not everything is allowed to be remixed, as you have off this black thing. For example, if you have by SA, you can't mix that in with something that's like by ND. for several different reasons. One, ND doesn't allow you to remix or edit the content, and share alike means that you can't change that license to a completely new license that reflects both of the licenses out there. And this is the general table that's off of here, and there's a link that goes on here. But the key aspect that I want you to be able to do in your breakout sessions when you actually start to look through each of these examples is to be able to look at a content on a page, identify the license on that page, if you can, and then ask, are you able to mix two things to satisfy those components of the licensing I put into? I expect it to be a little confusing, and that the discussion is going to be able to hone these things out rather than me trying to tell you exactly what you're able to do. Although I should give you this link in the chat window so you're able to peruse it if you want to be able to do that. So with that, I think that was the, so there's a set of 7 questions that are out there. I'm going to let, as soon as I find a chat, I'm going to paste into the chat window that that license compatibility chart so you can start to use that. And I'd like you guys to go to your respective corners in order to be able to have a discussion and go through these 7 points and start to ask the question here. I will mention that when you're asking these questions, you'll also want to ask the question, is it OER? Because that's not always, that's something you need to internally do. With that, I'll let Elena push you guys around, and then we'll come back and I'll give the second half of this. Okay, so there were a handful of different things that you can learn from that exercise. Besides the fact that whenever I go to examples, I tend to go to examples that are chemistry oriented because they, of course, is the best field that people should be studying. So the number one thing is that you probably recognize is that sometimes it's not easy to find what the licensing is of content. You have to do a search and you have to dig around in order to do it. So if you want to remix something, if you don't know the license of what it is, you basically have to assume you cannot touch it. That's all rights reserved, and that's the thing. The only one exception to that is if you have content that's from the federal government, and under most circumstances, the federal government does allow you to be able to consider it public domain in order to be able to operate. That does not apply to the state governments, and that does not apply to the UN out there. There you have to make sure that it says on that page or somewhere saying all these pages are this license. And that's it, period. The second thing you'll notice, hopefully, if you got down to the section that had the LibreTexts on there, is that the LibreTexts license that's on the page is always in the same spot, right below the title that you're always able to tap into. And oftentimes at the bottom of the page, it will be indicated there too, and part of the attributions. As part of our, if you want to remix effectively, you need to know licensing. And that's the third thing is that not everything can be remixed together on the same page. And even, and moreover, many people even conflict with that in the content that they put onto it, and they just basically don't violate that. And in some cases it's important, in other cases it's not. And we go through effort in order to be able to try to implement those things. So I encourage you to be able to pursue these, and as you ask for these things, evaluate whether things are useful. Or what the licensing or what you can really do in remixing it. It is one of the more painful processes, again, involved in remixing OER. And it's a skill set that I can't give to you, within a few minutes like we have right here. So the key point is on the LibreText, we provide individual licensing on each page, which is put up there. And hopefully, if we're doing things right, the content that's on the page follows that single license appropriately. It is possible in order to make subsections on a page that have different licenses. We don't typically do that. Actually, we've never done that, but we could. And what we don't do is provide a single license for a whole book. Okay, a book is an aggregate of things, and each page has its own licensing, and the way you operate with that book is best to use the most restrictive license on there. So if there's one page on your book that has an NC clause on it, you cannot sell that book, even if 99.9% of the pages on there don't have an NC clause. So you want to pay attention to that if you want to be able to commercialize that. Most of what we're doing here doesn't really matter in regards to that, because we have altruistic reasons for doing what we're doing off of that. So Let me mention a few things that we're doing in order to try to guide and enforce compliance with these licensing. So one of the benefits of having things centralized is that we can start to implement these procedures in order to, again, guide and enforce compliance off of that. The first one is an early warning system. And I'll show you the example. And that one there is enforced, and it's on our site already. And you've probably already seen it. One is controlled copying and one is controlled editing. Those last two things have not been implemented, but they're on the docket in order to be able to do these things. So the early warning system is essentially, it warns users that when you copy content, it tells you what permissions you're allowed to do with that content based on the licensing on that content. So typically that's a bar that comes down that's color coded and tells you the things that you're allowed to do. The point behind that is to be able to educate users in what they're being able to do. It's sort of the thing that this exercise was meant in order to be able to instill. The next level that we're going to be going into is controlled copying. So you will only be able to copy content that you have the ability to do something with it. And so we tend to put that within the content of ND content. So any ND stuff that we have, which is not much, you won't be able to copy the content off of that. And to ensure that when you do paste the content into another page that looks at the content license that you copied from, looks at the content license of the page that you're put into, and then compares it to that table and says, we're not going to let you do that. And so you basically will have to really trick the system in order to be able to copy the content over off of that. The last one is controlled editing. So it's if a page does not allow you to edit it, for example, if it's an ND clause, we'll remove the ability for you to be able to tap into the editing line and put it in. It's just basically that's the same thing. The same thing will also apply for licensing, that when you copy content or copy a page over that has a share alike license on it, that share alike license is going to be fixed and you're not going to be able to change it. And that's just part of the way that we're doing this. This is a general overview of the utility of having a centralized system for us to be able to instill this off of here in order to satisfy both legal and ethical obligations that we have in order to remix in the OER universe. So this is the example of the early warning system that we've had going for a handful of months. And again, you can see it. It's color coded. It should be green, green, yellow, red to give you the ability in order to be able to do these approaches off of it. There are some topic questions about Khan Academy. Khan Academy, under most circumstances, is not OER. That was one of the learning experiences off of there. They are not an OER organization. They are, well, they're not OER. I'll keep it at that. So let me, I've exceeded my time, which is what everyone expects me to do because that's how I talk. So I just wanted to mention something quickly here. The dissemination mechanisms in order to be able to get that variation out. Once you've constructed a viable textbook that you like, you're precious, it's been published, it's put into a course hub, campus hub, and it's able to be viewed, there are a variety of different mechanisms in order to distribute it. And these are oftentimes some of the barriers involved in order to be able to construct this stuff. So I mentioned before, but I want to mention again, if you want to go through mechanisms that are more traditional, you can get a physical copy of the book. And that provides a mechanism in order to be able to distribute content in traditional ways. It's highly cheap because you're just paying printer costs, so you don't need to pay for any profit off of that. It's also very useful when you're constructing your books to have a copy of the book as a draft. So there's something to be said about curling up in your corner of your couch late at night, typically with alcohol, and reading a general chemistry 2BH honors book or the course that you're doing. And you're seeing the big picture of how you typeset, how things are organized, and you catch lots of things that you don't catch online. And I can say that from experience. So it's oftentimes in honing your book, being able to put down $10 to get a physical copy of your book, and then being able to do that can make things much nicer in order to be able to pursue the editing. I mentioned that we have a dissemination mechanism through offline access, like the LibreTexts in a box, in which you can load the books or load the whole library into a Raspberry Pi box and then distribute it. That is useful for developing countries, which is how we started this. But then once we started looking into it, it became clear to us that there are lots of students and lots of places in America that don't have consistent access to high-speed internet, either because they don't have an infrastructure to high-speed internet, or they don't have the money for high-speed internet, or they move around too much in order to be able to tap into it. And offline mechanisms for dissemination is exceedingly important in order to be able to do that. For example, there are multiple community college campuses that have established hotspots in parking lots during the COVID situation, so the students can come in and get access to the internet in order to be able to do their stuff and then go back home in order to process that. Is there a question, Judy, or your?
Yeah, I'm really, this is boggling my mind as to what this is. This is not, doesn't give access to the internet, but it just—
This is a computer. A Raspberry Pi is a little computer that fits in your hand. It has an output that you can plug into a monitor if you want, but it's a hotspot. So it acts like if you pull up a phone or another computer, you can tap into it like an internet.
So it's not just LibreText. It's not just LibreText. It's internet.
No, it's not connected to the internet. It only will distribute the stuff that's on its SD card. So you can do it offline. So for example, if you go to conferences, I routinely get one of these things with conferences. I pack a battery on it that will last about 12 hours, and I walk around, and anyone around me can tap into it, just like you would with your phone that may have hotspot capabilities. It's just it doesn't let you tap into the internet. You just tap in the stuff that's on the computer itself.
So is it like a really fancy USB with its own internet? Like a thumb drive with its own internet access?
No internet. It is a thumb drive that lets anyone use Wi-Fi in order to tap into it and read what's on it.
Oh, okay.
Do a Google search of internet in a box.
Yeah, or Raspberry Pi. But it also does have USB output. It has 4 USB output ports. It has an Ethernet cable that you can use it like a computer. It has 2 video outputs off of it. Is it impressive computing? Not by any stretch of the imagination. Okay. Will it get the job done? Yes, it will. Okay, and can you distribute content off of it? Yes. You can send this out to a rural community, and students can pop this in, and then 30 students can tap into it and read their books.
Delmar, what is the cost to student?
The physical, nothing. The cost in order to get this thing approximately is like $45. So you can ship it out if you're in the middle of the, if you're at the top of Mount McKinley. Sorry, Mount. Can't remember the new name. Mount Everest. I can go with that. You can do your homework. If you're military, you're in the middle of the Atlantic, a mile below the ocean, you can do your homework. It's unconnected off of that. The second part of that is the LibreTexts in the phone, and this will be coming out in a few months. Knock on wood, which is the ability in order to also provide offline access on your phone, but it doesn't require hardware. All it requires is to download an app that will be available, and you can come in when you get access to the internet, like at a campus, and you can download your 5 books for your campus, for your class as a student, and for your term, and then you can basically turn off the Wi-Fi and you have full access to your internet with a lot, not all, but a lot of the features that you get from online with the JavaScript capabilities. Far more than what you would get if you downloaded a PDF of it, for example, and such. We're very excited about this because this is a very powerful approach in order to disseminate content effectively. And these are, again, the 2 LibreTexts in the phone, LibreTexts in the box mechanisms for offline access to the site. So I had a bunch of flowcharts, which are not overly important other than showing you I can make flowcharts or steal flowcharts from different people and technologies. They're meant in order to discuss some of the approaches that the LibreNet Consortium has put in place. The LibreNet, again, you've heard the term before and I've mentioned briefly, is run by our LibreTexts Inc., which is a not-for-profit organization incorporated in California, in order to maintain the sustainability of the LibreTexts project, where campuses can buy into the LibreNet, get a range of different opportunities in order to, for example, have an infinite number of of textbooks for their hubs and branding and other things like that in order to move forward. It's relatively cheap. It's $500 per campus. It's meant to rely on scale, not on individual campus support in order to be able to do that. And that all goes 100% in order to maintain the project. No profit involved if it, or no fake profit involved in order to be able to operate that.